Dipping In Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very, very fortunate this morning to be sitting down with Jared Whitaker. Jared is an author and a campaigner for male victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So good morning, Jared.
Morning, Lucy. Thanks for having me on.
No, absolutely. Very, very lovely to have you on. So as I tend to do, I kind of hand over to you to explain a bit more about what you do, why you do what you do, and we'll take it from there.
Cool, brilliant. So I'll start with what I do. So I write books around topics that affect primarily males, but actually they're pretty useful for women as well. And I do touch on things like that. But my books out at the moment are around domestic abuse and narcissism, and they include my story as a survivor, stories of other men, and actually some interviews with women survivors of domestic abuse as well. I'm branching out into other topics now besides domestic abuse with all the kind of, let's call it the ancillary abuse, like false allegations, parental alienation, post-separation abuse, etc. So books will be coming out on those. And then I actively just try and campaign, raise awareness for a topic that doesn't get enough attention. Yeah, and that's what I do. Who I am, I guess, is I used to be in the corporate world for 20 odd years. I actually ended my corporate career as CEO of a global IT firm, but I've given all that up to do what I do now. Just because I believe in it, because of what I went through, because there's so many people out there that can't stand up and can't talk for themselves. I also host a show and host a YouTube channel called Strong Men with Jared Whitaker, and that's just a little play on the fact that obviously we need to be strong men to get out of there. And also I do strongman training, competing, and things like that. So, you don't have to be a small, weak guy to get abused. Anyone can get abused, and I think that's the kind of message I like to try and get across to people.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message as well, because so often, whether male victims, female victims, so often people have this idea in the head of what they think a victim looks like, what kind of job they do, what kind of environment they live in, all those kind of things. And actually, it is just breaking down that whole stigma, isn't it? And saying, actually, anyone can be a victim of domestic abuse. And and anyone can be a perpetrator. So it's that's the complexities of it, is I think is trying to get that message. But I think what you're doing is fantastic, because as you say, it shouldn't be a case of looking at you going, well, you're a big guy. That's not the point. The point is we can all be in that situation. Because we all, if you're in a relationship and you believe that person is genuine, doesn't matter how big or small you are, if you think that person genuinely cares about you, and actually it turns out that they don't, that they're actually a perpetrator, then regardless of anything else, that is something that you have to process, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, people, this is a message I try to get across to people, is people think abuse is about gender or size or ethnicity or whatever. It has nothing to do with any of those things. It has to do with one person trying to exert their control on another person, and that's it. And it doesn't matter who the person is, what they look like. I always say to people, it's very easy to beat someone up when they won't fight back. So it doesn't matter if you're man, woman, whatever. And I mean, to your point of like people having this weird stigma. I mean, when I spoke to the police about it for the first time, they laughed at me.
Wow.
Literally laughed at me and were like, "Oh, come on, mate, come on."
Wow.
And I was like, "Okay, well, that's the kind of response you get from officials,
And that's how do you again, that's I think one of the major reasons that men and male victims and survivors find it very difficult to talk about abuse and what they've experienced, is because exactly that, they don't think they'll be believed. And as you've just touched on earlier then about the parental alienation, you're worried you won't see your children. There's so many aspects of it, I think, for men, that make it very, very difficult to actually reach out and talk. And as much as we're going through this whole kind of shift in society over mental health and talking about things, it's one of the most personal things to talk about abuse, isn't it? It's one of the most, if not the most personal thing to share with another human being, what you've experienced, because it is so traumatic, it is so negative. So then for somebody not to take that seriously, that's, well, yeah. I don't even know what the word is for that, but it's one that I can't use on this episode.
Yeah. And I think that's a big problem I find with a lot of the men I talk to, is they, not only have they have the stigma of, I'm a guy, I'm meant to be tough, I'm meant to be strong, this shouldn't be happening to me. And also I know society doesn't like talking about stuff like this. But then there's also that added thing of, well, I'm not going to be believed. And actually, when I started working on my first book, at the gym I train at, where I do my strongman training, there's a lot of obviously big guys there, bodybuilders, strongmen, powerlifters. And I started opening up to them about what I was doing and things like that. And literally within the first few weeks of me opening up, I think at least 10 of them came and said, well, actually, it's happened to me as well, and started talking to me about it. And they weren't willing to open up until someone else did first, which has kind of spurred me on to say, okay, well, if I can keep talking about it, then hopefully other people will look at it and go, okay, well, I can too.
Yeah, it's not, and that's the whole point, is get rid of that blame and that shame culture that, you're not allowed to talk about it. It's, you've got to be strong, you've got to keep those emotions in. No, actually, it's perfectly acceptable. And actually, it's healthy to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, that's where all the problems stem from. And I remember saying to somebody recently about, the link between your mental health and domestic abuse. Like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. Well, of course, if you're being psychological, it's not always a case of physical abuse. In many, many cases it is. And it's a mixture of a lot of elements of abuse.
Yep.
But, the psychological as well. I've worked with victims who said that's what lasts, the longest for them, in terms of that is for the rest of your life. That is, they're trying to move forward every day with something that's been so psychological, so embedded in controlling who you are as a person. That isn't something that you get over and move away from. It's something that you learn to live with and you learn to process. But like you say, doing what you're doing, which is so healthy, because it's actually helping people, and it's saying, okay, well, if I can talk about it, I maybe hopefully will encourage more men to talk about it.
Yeah. And I think you made a couple of really good points there. There's that whole sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Yeah.
Other way around, actually. Bruises heal, but what happens inside of you during an abusive relationship takes a lot longer to. And I don't think heal is the right word, because you never actually heal. You just learn to live with it,
Yeah.
and it becomes part of you. But interesting you said about it's not always physical. And this is a big problem I have when I'm talking to men's groups or things like that. As guys, in particular, we only think abuse is physical.
Yeah.
So I ran a survey and ran a poll for men saying, how many of you that were in an abusive relationship thought you were being abused before you got hit? And it was, I think 87%, no, I didn't realize I was being abused, and 13%, oh, it actually never got physical. So
Yeah.
no one knew they were being abused before, and I didn't. And that was about 4 years into my relationship that I got hit for the first time. But looking back now and seeing like all the emotional abuse, verbal abuse, all of that kind of stuff, it starts from the beginning, and they groom you into it to the point where they know they can hit you and you're not going to do anything
You're not
about
going to tell you. Yeah.
it.
It's really good points to make, and I think that's again what we need to take that shift away from so many adverts that make it appear to be all about the physical. And it's not for 1 second taking away from those who have experienced the physical, because obviously it's disgusting, it's disgraceful. But like you say, it is that what it does to a person when something is said repeatedly as negatives. We do take that on board, and we very often, and to quote, I think it's Pretty Woman, where she says the bad stuff's easy to believe. Well, if somebody repeatedly keeps saying to you, I won't say the swear words, but lots of things about, your size or your weight or whatever it be, all these horrible things that can be said, or you're stupid. That's a classic, you're thick, you're stupid. These are things that stay with people, like you say. And I totally agree on, I suppose for everybody, it's down to what they find comfortable in terms of the terminology they use. I personally find healing is something that I think for some people it works. I think for others, I think you're right. It is very much a case of moving forward and trying to process, because you might think that you've healed and you move up, but then something will happen, something may trigger you, something may come back to you that you've completely forgotten about, and you have to then go back and process that. So I'll often say, you know, if you are looking at life and saying, okay, so on a day-to-day basis, you've experienced abuse, there will be days where you feel on top of the world and you feel like you're absolutely in control of everything again and your life's, you know, yours, and then something will happen, and that's part of the post-separation abuse, is you're straight back to the beginning. And how soul-destroying is that? How devastating is that? And I think that's where it's that process rather than healing. Yeah, I do. I
Yeah.
agree.
And I think what people need to understand if they haven't been in it is these people doing these things, these abusers and narcissists, they're so, and I hate complimenting them, so I don't like using words that sound like compliments, but they're so clever in the way they just embed their
Mm,
hooks into you in every aspect of your life, for emotional, verbal, mental, physical, financial,
yeah.
everything. And so every single part of you, and they're working on all of those parts constantly running them down. I mean, when I left during my relationship, and then when I got out, it took me years. And like I said, I mean, I do strongman. I'm a big guy. I think I'm 6'2" and I weigh like nearly 130 kilos. I'm big, I'm strong. But when I was in my relationship and when I left, I had this mental image of myself as really, really small. And I've actually got a mate now at the gym. And when we started training together years back, I would say to him that he was bigger than me. And I
Mm.
honestly believe that he was actually much, much bigger than me. And the other day we were at gym together and I was standing next to him and I said, "Oh, mate, I'm way bigger than you." And he was like, "Yeah, I know." And I think I'm about 7 inches taller than him and like twice his size. And he was like, "Yeah, you used to think you were smaller than me, but like you're massive compared to me."
Yeah.
And just that absolute control of my mind to think something that I wasn't because it had been reiterated for
That's
years.
fascinating, actually, because it's
Yeah,
it's all that's really like the metaphorical and literal of feeling
yeah,
small, you know, and how it can. Somebody used the word once to me, cunning. You know, they're very cunning, and I always think I come back to that word so often when I think of certain situations and certain people, and that's the thing is it's how they can manage to spin all those plates constantly. I've always thought must be exhausting, but that's what they do,
yeah,
and they do it because they know that they know that they can control you. And you're right, it does have that effect on you where it takes a long time, and it's varied for everybody. But you do get to a point, I think, where you start to look at yourself and go, I'm not small, I'm not stupid, I'm not ugly, I'm not fat. We are all beautiful in our own ways. And I think for me, it's more about the beauty from within somebody. So when you're talking to somebody, that to me is what I think is beautiful, when somebody can express themselves and talk about things and share the way, the way you do, the way lots of people do. I think it's amazing. And I think that's the only way we'll ever break down that kind of how we'll break the chain, if you like, with perpetrators, to say, actually, I'm none of the things that you claim to believe that I am. That's what you believe. That's fine. You carry on, but I'm not that person, and I
yeah.
refuse to be that person. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even though I wrote my first book for other people, it's my story, and actually a lot of it was for me. And while writing it, I realized so much that again I had like these kind of big ticket items in my head that this was done to me, this was done to me. But as I started delving into the educational pieces around like tools and techniques and like gaslighting and isolation and stuff, then I started to realize, oh, actually, this was done, and it allowed me a chance to see what was done, understand it, unpack it, and move past it.
Yeah.
And then start looking at one of the exercises I put in there was about understanding who it is you actually want to be for yourself
Mm,
rather
mm,
than who you've been made to be.
mm.
And just looking at that, it was really useful for me to look at it and go, okay, well, that's actually not me. That wasn't me. That wasn't me. Not from a shifting blame point of view, but from a, well, that's not who I want to be in life, and this is who I want to be now, and I'm going to be myself.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's very much a part of what anyone who's experienced abuse, I would like to think, would want for themselves, is to find out who they are. I think, again, I love my quotes, but it was a Dolly Parton one years ago. I'm sure she said, find out who you are and do it on purpose. And I
Yeah,
thought, I love that, because you become somebody you're not when you were the perpetrator, don't you? And that's part and parcel of the whole problem, really. Is it's then, like you've just said, unpacking. It's so true, it is unpacking all those things. And I think as well, who somebody is when they're a victim within a relationship, depending on whether they're in the 20s, 30s, whatever point of time in life they're at, we're all very different as we get older, and we learn so much, and we can look at our parents when we're in our teens and go, what do they know? And then when you start creeping up to their age, you go, actually, they knew quite a lot. And I've got to admit that they knew more than I wanted to admit to myself. But we do learn a lot as we grow, and I think we do definitely learn who we want to be and who we want to be to our children, what example we want to set, even to our friends and family, because I think so often, again, for victims and survivors, their family and friends, it's a huge part for them. They don't know how to respond to things, how to broach the subject, how to even have that, if they can see it. And again, it's something that crops up quite a lot with victims and survivors, is their family and friends will say, oh, I could see them coming a mile off, or, oh, I could have told you years ago. And none of that's helpful, because all you're doing then is still blaming that person. And I think the education around family and friends and helping them understand, look, if you are going to try and be supportive, then listen. Listening is the
Yeah.
biggest tool at your disposal.
Well, it's literally how I came up with the title of my first book, because we were sitting at a barbecue with someone, and we were talking about someone else we know who's going through some problems, and they said, "Oh, why doesn't she just leave him?" And I thought, well, it's not that easy. And I was trying to explain to them, and they just didn't get it. So the title of my first book is "Why Didn't You Just Leave Them?"
Yeah.
and other ignorant things people say about abusive
I love it.
relationships.
I don't just other ignorant things people say.
Yeah.
It
And
is
this,
ignorant.
but there's so many in there. And, I've had people attack me going, oh, how can you call people ignorant? They don't know. I'm like, yeah, that's what ignorant means. Uh,
Yeah.
you're talking about something you don't know as if you're an authority, but you don't know.
Yeah.
And I had it with people saying to me like, oh, you're both as bad as each other, or,
Oh, yeah.
all
Tit
these
for
things,
tat. Yeah.
and it just, that to me was actually more hurtful than a lot of the abuse, is people close to you dismissing you.
Yeah.
And that's what I really, like you said, learn. It's about learning. And you go to school and they'll teach you long division, which I don't think I've ever done long division again in my life.
I'm
Um,
with you there.
but they'll teach you stuff like that, but they won't teach you like how to pay your bills, how to pay taxes. And this is stuff that actually should be taught to older kids, because they're going out into the world, into relationships, and they don't know the world's a scary place.
Yeah. Yeah.
They should be taught. I mean, obviously not the depth and the details, but just an overview of these things can
Yeah.
happen. Here's what you can do if they do happen. A
Yeah.
little bit of understanding would be good.
I couldn't, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is something that, to me, if all of us who work in this industry, in this area, sadly, got together and put something together for schools, I think it'd be phenomenal, because that's the sad fact of the matter is it shouldn't be something that we have to talk about in schools, but it also sadly is a case that, yeah, we do have to talk about it, and teaching children, teenagers, that having boundaries, that, if somebody does this at the start of your relationship, or if you start to notice this and this, or how you're made to feel about yourself, and because as teenagers, it's a long time ago, but I can remember I might have come across as confident, but I wasn't at all.
Yeah,
I wasn't confident in the slightest. So when somebody says something to you, you believe them, because you want to then kind of, be the perfect person to all these different people. So sadly, we do need to talk about it in schools, because if you don't have those tools, those boundaries, those things that you can say, well, actually, no, that's not for me. And with social media and with technology and all the things we have around us now that sadly cause a lot of the additional harassment and stress and everything else, then it is going to get worse, and we do need to talk about it. We do need teenagers, young people, to understand that they don't have to agree to everything. They do have a right, and they do have choices. That's the thing. I think so often, like you said, it took a long time to leave. That's something I think that doesn't get talked about enough, in terms of, well, what for so many victims and survivors, what choice do they have?
yeah,
For some people, it would be a case of, well, I'll be homeless if I leave. If people aren't married, if it's a cohabiting situation, there's so many levels to it, so many problems and issues and challenges that I think people don't see, and that's why it's not that easy. And again, you touched on it before. It isn't just when we said it's not just the physical, it is the psychological. It can be the financial. It can be the sexual. It can be there's so many other things that are going on and touching every area of your life. You're quite right. And how then can somebody turn around and say, well, why don't you just leave? You know,
Yeah.
can you imagine having every area of your life being controlled and manipulated and coerced, and then just say, and especially if children are involved, you know, how how do you then just feel it's acceptable to say, well, just leave? Yeah.
Well, the thing for me is, I kind of excuse people in my life, and I've forgiven everyone in my life that said stuff like that and whatever, but they don't know. And
No.
obviously, how would they? Because, again, it's the lack of education. Why would you know about this stuff if you haven't gone through it? But what really, really, really angers and upsets me is the fact that the people who are meant to know, like police, social workers, CAFCAS, court, they don't even know. And
No.
then they don't know. And they come and they go, oh, you always have a choice. And oh, if and they just have no clue whatsoever what it's actually like and what you're actually dealing with. So they literally will come to you and say, well, just leave.
Mm.
It's like, okay, where must I go?
Yeah.
Oh,
Where am I going to go? Where am I
I
going to
slept,
go? Yeah.
I slept in my car very, very many times, and it's not something I want to really do again.
No.
And what help is there? And I've tried to put that into my books. What can you actually do to help someone in your life? What can you do for yourself? Where can you go? What can you do?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I had no clue when I was going through it. I literally had absolutely none.
Yeah.
So I mean, I remember, walking the streets in the middle of the night, sleeping in my car. I had to start my life over from scratch with nothing, literally with nothing, and start over because I had no idea. So that education is so important.
It's hugely important, and you know, you're right, it is that for so many people, again, they don't appreciate that for victims and survivors, it is starting from scratch. And as you progress and as you move further down the line, things, for thankfully a lot of people, do improve, but you have to stick it out, don't you? Because again, I've worked with victims and survivors who've gone back to the perpetrator because they think, well, this is better than what I could end up with in the future. And it's that fear of the unknown, isn't it? And like you say, all those services involved, and then having the fear of the unknown of what's going to happen in the future, to stay that course and say, this is what I'm going to do. And I am going to, even though I've got nothing, I am going to have a better life. I'm determined to have a better life. It's it's not an easy path to tread.
Yeah, I did a really interesting interview for my last book with a female survivor of domestic abuse, and she didn't leave her partner, not because of having to start over or whatever,
Yeah,
but she was so terrified of what he was going to do because of all his threats against her
yeah,
children and things like that and her family, that she was kind of, better the devil you know. If I'm
yeah,
with him, I know where he is. I know what mood he's in. I'm going to take the punishment, but they aren't.
yeah.
And, she did eventually manage to get out, and it was a long thing, but people need to understand that as well. And she went through
Yeah.
hell with social services threatening her. Oh, we're going to take your children away unless you leave. You've got a choice. You must just leave. But no, not offering any assistance, just telling her she must.
No solutions, no, yeah, exactly, no tools to help her. And again, you know, we're touching on something that doesn't get talked about enough, is there are people, and I can say this from experience of working with people, there are people who choose to stay. Now, we are not in a position, any of us, to judge why somebody was, you know, because a lot of people say get out, stay out. Well, that isn't, it's not a blanket approach to it, sadly. It'd be great if it was a blanket approach and we could deal with all situations in the same way, but you can't, because it's unique to each person. And we don't know what people's circumstances are. What if they cared for the person? What if they were the one that was cared for by the perpetrator, if they had disabilities? Or, you know, there's so many things that people don't understand. And I think in those situations, that as a society we need to be able to say, and for the services to be able to say, okay, well, if you are going to stay in that situation, we need to talk about how to keep you safe as best as
Yeah.
possible. You know, not just write them off and say, well, if you don't leave, then we're going to take your children away. Or if you don't leave, you know, look into the situation, find out why that person is staying, and maybe look at how you can help them.
I wrote a chapter in the first book called Surviving When You Can't Get Out, and actually got a lot of stick from it from people because they were like, oh, you shouldn't be encouraging people to not get out. Like, I'm not encouraging them to not get out, but sometimes you cannot get out.
Yeah.
And I think something you and I chatted about before you started recording is getting out isn't getting out, so you can get away, but there's
Yeah.
still a journey to get out.
Yeah.
It's not a case of you leave and that's it, it's finished, because there's still everything that goes with that. I mean, if you've got kids, it's all the court hearings. If you were married, it's the divorce. If you live together, there's so much that happens after you get away that you can
Mhm.
only really say you're out after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, something that I know you're going to touch on is something I'm massively passionate about is post-separation abuse, because it is something that is so goes so undiagnosed, undiscussed, because again, it is this idea that once you have left the situation, and I will always say, if you are in a position where you can leave, then it isn't that straightforward. It isn't as simple, like you've just said, getting out's one thing and getting it, but it's actually getting away and actually living a life without all the puppeteering and threads that are there that nobody else can see, that are still going on and are still, because they can't let go of that control. You've come
Yeah.
to a decision and you've decided, this is something that is right for you, for the children, whoever, and actually that perpetrator will say, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not going to happen. And I'm going to do everything I can to tear down this new person that you want to be, because they don't like seeing that person. Because actually, on many levels, maybe that's the person you always were, and you lost so much of that while they chipped away at every little part of you. And
Yeah.
then when you start to rebuild, but the beauty is, I always think is, you rebuild, but you rebuild better. Who you were, like we were saying before about age, when you're younger, there's so many things you don't understand. As you get older, you've now got things, you've got tools, you've got understanding, you've got determination that you wouldn't have had all those years ago. And that to me will always be kind of the secret weapon that perpetrators won't be able to deal with once they realize that you are more determined than they are.
Yeah. I always find myself every day in a catch-22. I desperately want my abuser to get someone new so that they can stop bothering me years later.
Yeah.
But at the same token, I don't want them to get someone new because I don't want him to go through what I went through, and he will,
Yeah, of
obviously.
course, of
So I'm
course.
stuck in this catch-22 that I want and don't want at the same time. So
And I think that's a very honest opinion. And I think a lot of people who listen and watch this will resonate with that, because I think that's you're being really truthful there, and well, you're being truthful full stop. But I think that's a really important point to make. Is yes, it would be, yeah, take your focus somewhere else. Thank you very much. But actually, that person, whoever it is, will have to then go through, and the awful thing is, you have to, I think, maybe get to a point where you think, but that's going to have to be something, it's awful, isn't it? Because you don't want them to go through it, or whoever they may be in the future. But at the same time, you have to focus on you, on your, children, and all your own relationships. And I think, again, that's part of who victims and survivors are, is they're very much empaths more often than not. I
yeah,
don't think I've met one that isn't. and cares deeply about everybody. And that's why it is so hard to leave as well, a lot of the time, aside from all the other things that are going on. I did an episode recently, I haven't released it yet, but we talked about what you believe about somebody. When we meet people psychologically, we want to believe the best. We don't go into relationships going, I know, I'm going to go and find a really abusive relationship and I'm going to stay in that for years. Nobody does that. That's not how it works. We go into a relationship believing that that person cares, is considerate, and boy, can they turn on the charm and the kindness and the this and the that when it suits. And then it's only over time that slowly starts to diminish,
well,
and
I
you're
think
in.
it's even more insidious than that, and more evil when you think about it. That you go into a first date with someone saying you like them, and you're starting to date
Yeah.
someone. First of all, that person's not going to punch you in the face at the first date in a
No.
restaurant. So you don't have that chance to just leave. It starts slowly and it builds up.
Yeah.
But the problem with it as well is you said, you believe the best of them,
Yeah.
but also because you're thinking they're a nice person, and you start opening up and you start telling them stuff about your life,
Yeah.
and you start telling them things that hurt you in your life or that are bad for you, like, oh,
Yes.
I had this bad relationship with so and so. And all that happens is they take all of those things and they store them away for later to use them as weapons against you.
Yeah. Yeah. See, you had this in your other relationship, so it's not me, it's you. It's
Yeah.
your problem. You're the bad apple, you're the issue, you're the center of it all. Yeah, and again, that is something that doesn't really get talked about, is the fact that they will do that. They will very much take on all those little things, store them away, and bring them out when you least expect it. And that in itself is terrifying.
Yeah.
I don't think I could store that many things up. I'm not going to lie. I think I'd struggle. I'm lucky to remember what I'm doing most days of the week. To
Yeah.
be honest with
Yeah.
you.
They remember everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely everything. It's a morbidly fascinating subject, narcissists,
It
because
it
it's
really
amazing
is.
how they work, but
Yeah.
horrific.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrific and destroys lives, you know, and the awful thing is, what people don't realize is whilst all this is going on, the children are getting older, your parents are getting older,
Yeah,
all the things that are going on for everybody else in the world and everybody else who, may or may not be in an abusive relationship. They may not even realize, like like you said before, many people don't even realize they're in one. Um, and life's moving forward, and it's having that. I think in terms of when children are involved, I think it's, again, I talked about this recently with somebody, saying, it has to, I think, get to a point where, especially with the children, where for victims and survivors is to say, I'm going to set aside this time now to not think about court, police, etc. And if it's just walking to the park, if it's just going to get an ice cream, whatever it is, take that out of your mind, focus on that present moment with your child and or your children, and actually, because that's what they'll remember
yeah,
that you were listening to what they were saying about the day. They'll remember. If you don't, then all they remember is mom, dad, look really distracted, or they weren't listening, or they're on the phone constantly. Well, they might be on the phone answering emails to a solicitor, or dealing with, like you say, divorce or whatever. So it's really, really tough. But what I would always say for any victim and survivor is I would never want them to look back and think there were so many opportunities that I missed with the children, that and the perpetrator stole that as well. Don't let them take any more. Take those moments if you can. It doesn't have to be all day, because it's very hard to not think about it all day. But if there's a little moment in time, if it's half an hour, kids won't remember how long it was, but they'll remember that you were there and you weren't, absent, even though you were present, if that makes sense.
yeah. And I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier about deciding what kind of person you want to be and who it
Yeah,
is you really want to be, and realizing that by being those things, you're winning, but by
yeah,
not being those things, they're winning,
yes.
and they're taking that away from you. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And so I wanted to ask, because people will need to know, but I'll be putting it on the links when I post stuff out anyway, because there's links to your book, isn't there? There's links to your website. Have I forgotten anything? Oh, YouTube channel.
Yeah, YouTube.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So we need to get all those on there. And you're in the process. Am I allowed to say you're in the process of writing
Yeah,
the book?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say I can always edit it out if not.
No, yeah. It's actually I'm nearly finished with it, so it's going to be out probably in the next 3 to 4 weeks if I put myself on a timeline to get it
Wow.
finalized.
You're better than me then, because I'm a procrastinator. If I know something's the deadline, I think, oh God, I'll get there eventually. But
Yeah,
no, what you do is absolutely incredible. And I think, you are helping so many people. You are helping. And what I love as well is, you're helping so many men. But like you said before, so much of what you say resonates across the board when it's talking about abuse, because,
yeah.
sadly, it does affect so many people, and the children that are in the crossfire of it all.
I mean, I've interviewed so many men and so many women, and I can tell you that there's no difference.
Mm.
Every woman I interview, and or if I talk to a bunch of women about my experiences, they go, "Oh, I think we were dating the same person." And if I talk to a bunch of men, they go, "Oh, I think we were dating the same person." The relationship and the abuse is carbon copy. It's like absolutely identical. The only difference comes in with the like stigma, dealing with officials and things like that. That's where the slight difference comes in. But relationship wise,
It's a
it's the same.
blueprint, isn't it?
Same.
It's as if they've got a handbook that none of the rest of us don't know about, that they all have this handbook, because you're right, when you talk to so many people, it's so similar. There's so many similarities, and it may be just a tweak that's slightly different, but that thread that runs through, it's
Yeah.
just the same. It's the
Well,
same.
I've got a little video on my YouTube channel around how I think there's a secret Harry Potter type school for narcissists that to go to.
Do you know
Fairly sure
what?
that's the answer.
I think you could be right. I
Yeah,
think you could
I
be
think
right.
that's
Yeah,
the
they're getting
answer.
their education from somewhere. I'm not
Yeah.
going to go on about parents and enablers and all that, because that's a whole other episode.
Oh yeah, yeah. But yeah, that's terrible. I think there was one point I really wanted to get across, and it's something I tell people I talk to, and I'll try to tell it in much less colorful language than how I tell it to them. Is when you get away and you have to start going through these things with like court and CAFCAS and social services and all this stuff, basically anything to do with family court, we can
Yeah,
summarize it as, it's going to be horrific, right? It's going to be horrible. It's going to be stressful. It's going to be absolutely, absolutely terrible. You're going to feel like people don't listen to you. You're not believed. You're lucky if they even read anything you send them beforehand. And whenever I tell people this and I go through, and I always think, oh, I sound really like doom and gloom, but it's horrific. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. And you have to go through it. But once you're through it, it's so worth it. But it's just going to be horrible to go through it. You have to just kind of be ready for that, because I wasn't. I went into court the first time thinking, this is court, it's fair and just, and they'll look at evidence and stuff like this. And I was so caught off guard by how it actually was. And now, after that first time, I could mentally prepare myself and realize what I was in for every time. But if you go in thinking this is going to be well, I've got the truth on my side, it doesn't work that way.
No,
Um,
no.
yeah.
That's, you know what, I think that's one of the best pieces of advice I've heard on an episode, because you're right, it is that doesn't get talked about. It is exhausting. It is such a long process. It can last for many, many years. And when people say to me about victims and survivors, how can it last years? It can last years. If your children are quite young when this all begins, and you've got till they're 16, 18, that sort of age, it's a long process and it's a long road. And I think, taking care of your physical, mental well-being, whether that's going to the gym, whether that's meeting up with friends, whether it's going for long walks, whatever it is, doing yoga, it doesn't matter what it is, you're going to need that, aren't you? You're going to need that to sustain. I think that's the word that's come into my head, is sustain, because it is a long, long process. And you're right, you think you're going in there, and so often victims and survivors just go, what? Hang on a minute, but I'm telling the truth. Yes, but what you're forgetting is a perpetrator is very good at not telling the truth and being believed by not telling the truth.
Yeah.
And if they come across as very charming and disarming, well, what are you going to believe? And you're right. I think that's a brilliant piece of advice. Thank you, because I think it lets people know as well. You're right. It does get better. There is light at the end of the tunnel. And if you just take it one step at a time, eventually you'll look back and see how far you've come. Yeah.
And I think that's really important. Is I got into this habit where one bad thing would happen, say in a 2 week period, because it was constant. I'd be like, oh my God. And what I started doing is I started setting up a session with my therapist every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And it was purely for the point of I'd sit down with her and I'd unpack the last 2 weeks and I'd say, these are the things that happened. It was a really terrible 2 weeks. And then she'd be like, well, hang on. You just told me these 2 bad things that happened, but then you also told me these 15 good things that happened. And then doing that, I could look at it, I could kind of step back and look at the whole 2 weeks and go, oh, yeah, actually, those were horrible, but the rest was actually really good.
Yeah.
But it's confirmation bias, and you get stuck into that rut. And so having someone, doesn't have to be a therapist, but it could just be like a good friend who you go for coffee with every 2 weeks, and just unpack those 2 weeks and understand that your life's not as terrible as your brain is trying to convince you.
Yeah, exactly, as your brain is trying to convince you. And the good will outweigh the bad. It is just that process of whether it's making a list, and saying, okay, so what has happened? And then you can think for yourself, oh, actually, these good things did happen. You're right, absolutely. And this is the kind of advice people need. You need to do almost like, what am I trying to think now? Yeah, do like an agony uncle.
Yeah.
You need to do that. Give some pearls of wisdom.
I'm gonna start dropping more videos on my YouTube channel. So the videos I've been doing currently have been just about education. So what is a somatic narcissist, what is gaslighting, etc. But I'm actually going to start going into more the advice portions. That they're all in the books, but some people prefer watching videos to reading books.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll do those kind of my top tips.
I love that, your top tips. That's a good idea. Well, I'll read it and I'll watch it.
Yeah.
Oh, Jared, thank you so much. It's been, I always hate to say it's a pleasure, because we're considering the topic. It always sounds weird when I say that, but it is actually a pleasure to speak to people who do understand, who do get it, and actually are making a difference, are doing things to make a difference, whilst they're also experiencing it themselves. And that, I think, doesn't get recognized either. Is a lot of people who are doing this kind of work are doing it under a lot of pressure themselves. So it takes immense courage to do what you do. So thank you very much.
No, welcome, and thank you.
And I will be seeing you very soon, I'm sure. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy.